And no question about that. Let me just tell you how I sort of think about the world at a macro level to try to make sense of it. And I'm not arguing that this is an approved solution, but it's just my sort of simple framework for thinking about how the world looks today. Of course, up until about 2017, certainly through all of the 1990s and the first decade and a half or so of the 21st century, we lived in a unipolar world. And in that unipolar world, the United States was by definition the only great power. That world went away, in my opinion, in about 2017. And we now live in a multipolar world. And what's very important to understand about that multipolar world is that for the United States, the most important region in the world is East Asia, because China is a peer competitor in the sense that China is a rising great power that threatens to even be more powerful than the United States. I'm not saying that will happen, but China is a formidable adversary for the United States. So you now have this multipolar world where East Asia is of paramount importance for the United States. And the United States still cares about two other areas of the world. One is Europe, and then the third is the Persian Gulf. So that's sort of the macro view I have at the highest level. But then if you look at the Ukraine-Russia war and you look at the Iran war, what you see is that these two conflicts almost are guaranteed to never go away and to create a poisonous security environment in both Europe and in the Gulf. And why am I saying that? It's very important to understand, I think, that from Russia's point of view, the situation in Ukraine is an existential threat. From Ukraine's point of view, Russia is an existential threat. I fully understand why both actors in that conflict, Ukraine and Russia, view the other as an existential threat. And Europe has piggybacked with the Ukrainians to the point where the Europeans think Russia is an existential threat, and the Russians think the Europeans and the Ukrainians together are an existential threat. And when you have two sides that both think the other side is an existential threat, how do you shut that down in any meaningful way? So I think you're going to have huge problems in Europe moving forward, mainly based on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Turning to the Gulf, as I said to you before, the Israelis view the Iranians as an existential threat, and Israel's supporters in the United States view Iran as an existential threat. And Iran views the United States and certainly Israel as an existential threat. But let's just focus on Israel and Iran. Those two view each other as an existential threat. How are we ever going to get a meaningful ceasefire between Israel and Iran, especially when Iran supports Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis and has no intention of giving up that support, and the Israelis view Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis as not as dangerous as Iran, but almost as dangerous as Iran, and joined at the hip with Iran. So what you're going to see moving forward, even if we get some sort of agreement between the United States and Iran, is a permanent state of hostility between Israel and Iran in the Persian Gulf or in the Middle East. And then back to Europe, you're going to see endless trouble moving forward, a poisonous relationship. You and I have talked about this before, between the Russians on one side and the Ukrainians and the Europeans on the other side. So again, just to go back to where I started, you have these three great powers in the system now, right, who compete with each other in all sorts of different ways. And with regard to the U.S.-China conflict, from an American point of view, China is the principal threat. East Asia is the number one area of the world. But if you look at the other two areas of the world, Europe and the Middle East, you have this very dangerous situation that doesn't seem to look like it's going to go away in both of those areas. And my final point would be to you, Glenn, you can tell all sorts of stories about how you hook the Chinese up to what's going on in the Gulf. Very easy to do. And the Russians, of course, are already involved in Europe. They're one of the principal participants in the war in Ukraine. And the Russians, of course, are involved in the Gulf. They're helping the Iranians. Both the Russians and the Chinese are helping the Iranians. And the Chinese, obviously, because they fear an American containment strategy in East Asia, the Chinese have a vested interest in seeing the Ukraine war go on and seeing the Americans pinned down in Europe. And in a certain way, they even have a vested interest in seeing the United States remain militarily in the Persian Gulf, because that means they won't be able to go to East Asia to contain China. So what I think you see with this rather simple framework that I'm putting on the table is that we live in a very dangerous world, and there's not much prospect that I can see. I hope I'm wrong, but there's not much prospect of creating a more peaceful world moving forward.
No, I'm not sure how the new equilibrium will be established, but I'm curious though what the U.S. goals then would be towards Europe, because if you have the world becoming multipolar, the U.S. can't be everywhere, has to make priorities. So the U.S. more or less prioritizes the Western Hemisphere and East Asia, where you said its peer competitors. Well, then the U.S. has to get out of the Middle East and Europe. Again, this is why the Iran war does make much sense in the wider strategy. But Europe, it seems even more important to get out of, because they consume a lot of resources. But more importantly is perhaps by having a too heavy American footprint in Europe, they're pushing the Russians closer to China. So when Trump said, I want to put an end to this war, in 24 hours, which was never, realistic, but at least it seemed to reflect that he recognized how the distribution of power was shifting. But that being said, I kind of assumed that he wanted to put an end to that war. But now we see this kind of these new statements. I did send you a link earlier on with the Undersecretary of War for Policy, Elbridge Colby, was making some remarks. It didn't sound like he wanted to put an end to the war. On the contrary, he called for the Europeans to essentially step up to the plate. He sounded not to end the war, but to outsource the war to the Europeans. So while the Europeans would like to pull the Americans deeper into the war, it seems the Americans want to outsource it to the Europeans. But do you read it the same way, or do the US want to put an end to it, or just to make it because if it's a European war, then they can continue to contain the Russians, and it's the Europeans' problems, and the Russians they signal they're willing to improve bilateral ties with the Americans, even though the US is still involved in Ukraine in terms of intelligence and sending weapons. But do you see a willingness to end the war? Or is it like perpetual war, forever war, which is possibly a strategy just to drain the Russians and make sure that the Europeans do it on their own?
Well, you should put that speech that Elbridge Colby gave in Europe up on your website so that people can access it. Glenn sent it to me. I'm talking to the audience here. Glenn sent it to me earlier today, and I read it very carefully. And of course, Elbridge Colby is a very important figure in the Pentagon, and his statement that Glenn sent me on April 15th is, I think, enormously important. And my interpretation of it, Glenn, is it said nothing about solving the war or shutting down the war in Ukraine. This was all about what I would call buck passing, shifting the responsibility for security in Europe at the conventional level almost completely over to the Europeans, and shifting responsibility for supporting Ukraine in the Ukraine-Russia war almost completely over to the Europeans. And this was a case of moving almost completely away from the Biden approach to dealing with Ukraine, where we were fully involved in the process and committed to fight till the end. And I think it's very clear that what's going on here is that the United States is deeply committed in Iran and in the Iran war. And we are using up significant amounts of our weapons inventory in the Middle East, in this Iran war. And that is weakening our position vis-a-vis the Chinese. If you look at the numbers of THAAD missiles and Patriot missiles and smart bombs and Tomahawks that we've expended in Iran. And by the way, Glenn, just to get off the subject that we're talking about for 1 second, one of the reasons that President Trump does not want to start the bombing campaign again and start the war up, because it would involve Iran retaliating against Israel and the Gulf states, is that he would have to use up more of the American inventory of weapons. They don't want to use any more weapons than they have to in a future conflict in the war against Iran, right? So we have very powerful incentives not to start the war up again against Iran because we have so depleted our inventory of weapons. And this has huge consequences for East Asia, where we're supposed to be in the process of containing China, the principal threat from the to the United States, right? So what Elbridge Colby is saying very clearly to the Europeans is we can't provide the weapons anymore for you to give to the Ukrainians. You Europeans have to develop the necessary weapons, and you have to do it quickly for Ukraine. We can't do it because we have other responsibilities. So this is, I think, the Colby speech, a clear statement of the Americans divorcing themselves from Europe at the military level. It's basically saying to the Europeans, you deal with the Ukraine war. They're not saying you shut down the Ukraine war. In fact, I think the document reads like, we expect the war to go on, and that's hardly surprising. We failed to shut the war down. They're not going to shut the war down. In fact, they have no interest in shutting the war down. The Europeans want this war to go on forever and ever. And the end result is that Ukraine is going to have to be supplied with lots of weapons. And the question is, where are they going to get those weapons? And up to now, it's been pretty much a case where the Europeans buy the weapons from the United States and then give them to the Ukrainians. And what Colby is saying is the cupboard's bare. There are no American weapons we can give you. We're running through weapons in the Gulf at an incredibly rapid pace. And that's having huge consequences for East Asia, which is strategically the most important area of the world. So in a very important way, what Colby is doing is divorcing the United States from Europe, especially at the conventional level. That's the way I read it. Do you disagree with that?
No, I think they're handing it over or cutting their ties further. I think this also could be a consequence of the Iran war as well. The fact that Trump has put a lot of rhetorical efforts to blame the whole thing on the Europeans, that could provide a reason, or at least to mobilize some support from decoupling the U.S. a bit more from the Europeans. But that also puts the Europeans puts us on a much closer to war, I think, here in Europe, because with the lack of American weapons, the situation is going more and more in Russia's favor, and the Europeans will have to escalate in a big way, which you see. All these drones being made and sent, and the very openness about our participation in this war, and at the same time, the reports now of the Baltic states and or Finland allowing their territory to be used to strike Russia. At some point, the escalation will put more pressure on the Kremlin to respond. And there is a growing pressure. And all of this is happening at the same time that the Americans are divorcing themselves. So now the Russians would have less constraints to retaliate. I mean, why would they fear striking some German logistics center if America's not standing behind? Is it the same as the Baltic states? The reason they've been behaving this way is you had always, big bad Uncle Sam standing behind you. If Uncle Sam's not there anymore, and instead of toning it down, they have to escalate. I think we're looking at a recipe for war. But
yeah, I mean, this gets to this whole point we were making before about what a plastic moment this is. I mean, just listening to you talk, what about the American security umbrella, the American nuclear umbrella over Europe, especially over Eastern Europe? If something happens in one of the Baltic states, what are we going to do? We meaning the Americans. It's really hard to imagine the United States getting into a fight with the Russians in one of the Baltic states at this point in time. So I think the Russians are kind of flexing their muscles these days vis-a-vis the Baltic states because they understand that. The other thing is, Glenn, I wonder what's going to happen when Ukraine finally loses this war. I mean, it's hard to say what the final arrangement is going to look like, but at some point the shooting is going to stop, number one. And number two, the Russians are going to end up controlling a huge slice of Ukrainian territory, which they've already annexed. I mean, they've annexed 4 oblasts and Crimea. And this is going to be seen as a devastating defeat for NATO, right? NATO lost. And President Trump will blame the Europeans. And if you think about Colby's speech is putting President Trump in a position where it will be easy to blame the Europeans because the Ukrainians have not lost now. We're divorcing ourselves. And at some point, the Ukrainians are going to lose. And when they lose, Trump will be able to say, we shifted the burden almost completely onto the shoulders of the Europeans. We were doing well, or the Ukrainians were doing well up until that happened. And then Ukraine fell apart. And of course, it's because of those pathetic Europeans who wouldn't help us in the Gulf, who wouldn't help open the Strait of Hormuz, or who wouldn't unilaterally open the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, this is all nonsense, but this is the rhetoric that he'll use. And this will just further tear at the seams of the alliance. It'll just make a bad situation worse. So I think what you're going to get in Europe, and I'd be curious to know what you think about this, I think you're going to get a situation where the United States is much less committed to Europe and to NATO, and at the same time, the relations between the Russians on one side and the Ukrainians and the Europeans on the other side are going to be even worse in the future than they are now.